Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today in a conversation about a new report that we're releasing. And today I have Michael Sadowski representing WRI, Emily McGarvey representing AII, and myself, Lewis Perkins, also representing AII. So I'm really glad you guys have joined me today as the authors of this report, the Roadmap to Net Zero report, which we've all been digging into and working on for the last many months. And it's been a great project to work with both of you guys. And we're grateful to Loudest Foundation also for helping to support and sponsor the development of this critical report releasing to the industry. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think overall, as this report is coming out, we have been socializing the content of the report for a while, but it's been something that the industry has been seeking, which is direction toward how to address decarbonization of the fashion, apparel, footwear industry. Michael, where did the real need for this report come about?
Sure. So about 3 years ago, World Resources Institute and the Science Based Targets Initiative published guidance for the apparel sector to set science-based climate change targets. And they did so because at the time, companies were setting targets that were inconsistent and weren't aligned with what science said we needed to do to actually stay within a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory. And so we produced this guidance 3 years ago. There were about 12 companies or so that had science-based targets at the time. And the guidance has really helped dramatically increase the number of companies with science-based targets. And so we're at about 140 today. And through that, we have had a lot of conversations, Lewis, Emily, and I, with companies, brands, manufacturers, retailers, material suppliers, that really had questions around how does the industry get to this 1.5C pathway. We know what we have to do, but we don't know how to get there. And so we decided to work together, WRI and AII, to put this roadmap out to the world to bring together the best thinking that we have about how the industry can deliver on these ambitious targets. And it's good timing with COP26 because we see all these commitments and it's really time to get to action and to show the industry how to deliver.
Yeah, that's great. Emily, what would you add to that? And specifically, I think, the role that you've been playing representing the work of AII in this report.
Well, this has been a really great collaboration that we've had with WRI, and I think it's been a really natural collaboration as well, because AII's mission is to identify, fund, and scale proven solutions within the industry. And the whole purpose of this report is to identify the actions that the apparel sector needs to take to deliver on those ambitious targets. So the work that WRI had already done on the sector guidance and the work that we're doing in really implementing a lot of those solutions, it made sense for us to really come together and work together on what this roadmap looks like for the industry.
That's right. And I think as much as it tells us what we know, it also reveals to us a little bit about the white space, which I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the opportunities, but it's necessary to know what doesn't exist that is within areas that we have to really have a call to action for investment and research and development as well. So yeah, I'm excited about the report from that perspective, and I know we're going to dive into that a little bit more. So tell me, Michael, a little bit about the methodology. I mean, there've been other reports out there that have looked at carbon and climate and what kind of, what makes this unique in terms of the methodology and the data that you've used and what partnerships you've used to help put this together.
Yeah, so if you work in the apparel sector or if you follow it or even not, you know that over the past few years, we've seen various headlines about the carbon intensity of the apparel sector. So you've probably seen claims, the apparel sector is 8% of global emissions, 10% of global emissions, 4% of global emissions. So there are quite a few estimates that have been made. And I will say we've introduced a new estimate, and some folks will question why. But what I will say to this question that we get often, like, what are the emissions of the apparel sector? I will just say, we don't know for sure, and it really depends on the authors, data sources, and assumptions that they make. But we've decided to work with textile exchange data, so fiber volume data from textile exchange, as well as Higg MSI data to calculate the industry footprint, knowing that this data, because it's secondary, and I can talk to that in a bit if we need to, that the data is imperfect, and thus our estimates should really be viewed as directional. But we believe that in using Higg data and textile exchange data, we're using widely accepted data and used data by the industry. And over time, the MSI is designed to be improved as material vendors are measuring the footprints of materials and processes. That database is only going to get better over time, and that we know that the MSI connects in with the broader Higg index. So the Higg facility environmental module, in our opinion, is really the best chance we have of gathering primary data. So, actual emissions data from facilities and not estimated data. That's really our best chance. So by bringing together textile exchange data and Higg data, we think this actually sets us up to have repeatable analysis over time and to be based on data that is most widely used by industry participants.
Yeah, and it's kind of obvious to state, but without 100% primary data coming from every manufacturing facility on the planet, there's no way to actually get the real real number. Everybody wants to say, well, but what is the real impact of carbon? And there's at this point, it would be impossible to get that. But the best, what I'm hearing you say, the best way to get there is to continue to double down on the tools that we have that collect that primary data.
That's right. And I realize that people want to know the number. And it's just, as we read in the report, to do that, I think we have some data in the report about like how many suppliers H&M and Nike and others have. Like it's hundreds or thousands. And then you get to the cotton farm level and the polyester production. To do a fully robust estimate, you would need to know the actual emissions data from finished goods all the way back to cotton farm, for example. And we just don't have that. So we're using the best data that we think we have. And we think that emissions are around 2% of global emissions, about a gigaton. But I think we're really mindful to say this is directional. We can't say for certain because we're not basing this on primary data. But regardless, we know where the hotspots are and we know how to reduce emissions. So just because the data is not top quality, it doesn't stop us from acting, and it doesn't stop us from isolating where the big hotspots are.
Right. And over time.
One other thing, Louis and Michael, one other really interesting thing about all these different reports that have the different sector baselines, the baseline is super important. And they all have slightly different numbers just for the reasons that Michael just talked about. But what's really interesting is if you look at all those reports, the action that they're telling the industry to take is all the same. They're telling people in the biggest buckets, they're really telling people to look at efficiency, renewables, and more preferred materials. And so that shouldn't be lost either, is that even though the numbers may be different for the baseline, the actions that all these reports are telling us and encouraging the industry to do is really the same. And that's, I think, really important.
Well, yes, exactly, Emily. That was the question I was just going to ask to you. So you're telling me I shouldn't just sit and wait until I have perfect data to get started?
Absolutely not. There's all sorts of things that we can do, and we know what actions we need to take. And part of what the roadmap is that we worked on for this report is really helping to guide and direct the whole industry into the same interventions and the same actions, so that we're all working collectively together.
Exactly. And I want to come back to you on that in a minute, but let's talk about what are these interventions, or we're calling them the levers. Michael, and Emily, what are the levers that we're focusing in on in this report?
Yeah, so I think we may have a graphic on this as well, but I can kind of share what we're talking about with the 6 levers and the 6 interventions. So really here you can see the first one is really around maximizing material efficiency. And so that's around design and material selection and methods of production. That's really reducing the amount of material that's going to waste. And that's really across all of the tiers. When we look at the second intervention around scaling more sustainable materials and practices, this is just increasing the use of preferred and sustainable materials. And so that is moving into, more preferred cotton and recycled polyester and things like that. The third one is around accelerating the development of next generation materials. So we know some preferred materials that are already out there, but some we need to really that next generation and really think about how textile to textile recycling is going to help us get to another generation of new materials that we maybe haven't dreamed up yet, or some things that we're working on but need to get scaled and brought into full production. Then if you move over into maximizing energy efficiency, this one's pretty straightforward, but it's really reducing the energy consumption across manufacturing through efficiency. And efficiency is, such a straightforward thing, but it is so important to make sure that we are being as efficient as possible in our production. The next one is really around eliminating coal in material and product manufacturing. So coal is a really big fuel source for thermal energy and for electricity. And so this one is really about both switching fuel types as well as changing processes and moving from wet processing to dry processing. So eliminating coal is a really big one that we have some work to do with. And then the last one is shifting to 100% renewable electricity for all manufacturing. And so that's thinking about solar and wind and that type of thing. So all of these levers combined is really what makes up the roadmap that we're sharing in the report today.
Yeah, great. Michael, as you look at this and as you've been deeply developing, what are the challenges, or any barriers or solutions maybe that you see when you look at these?
Yeah, so just to reiterate what Emily said, these 6 are not groundbreaking and unique. I think the other authors of research understand these. I think for us, we just wanted to pull them together and try to dimensionalize what the potential impacts look like. And I'll just flip to one slide and leave this up. Hopefully that's somewhat visible, but it is in the report. And I'll talk more a bit about this in a moment. But I would say that there are, amongst the interventions, and the interventions are in that key on the right-hand side, some of them are ready to go today. And so energy efficiency, AII and others have known programs that can be deployed in factories to save money, right? So these things are kind of no-brainers. Things like recycled materials, recycled polyester is a well-known material. It's being widely used by many brands. For that, it's really driven by cost and quality. And so depending on where the price of oil is on a given day, recycled poly will look good or not so good from a cost perspective. So there are things that we can do today. Many countries, renewable energy is viable because of the resource and maybe the policy regime. In other countries, shifting to renewable electricity is a challenge because you can't do large scale renewables. And so, we know that brands and others are working to change the policy environment in places like Vietnam to make renewables possible. Things like getting out of coal for thermal energy, for me, that's probably the toughest one to crack because you can potentially make a shift from coal to gas, which maybe cuts your emissions roughly in half. Not every country has a gas supply, and ultimately we're trying to drive to net zero. And then biomass is another alternative that's often raised. And again, biomass supply may not be there, number one. Number two, all sorts of unintended consequences and implications for burning, crops or other biomass for fuel. And so there, I think investment is needed to figure out, how do we electrify thermal energy processes, and how do we then address the renewable energy environment so that there's more renewable energy to drive the thermal processing. So, and to Emily's point, dry processing, waterless dyeing, things like that have to come into play as well. So, we know there are things that companies can do today, and we know that there are coalitions working on each of these things together.
That's great, and I think as we discussed earlier, this report not only tells us where to go, it's telling us also where the call for more investment, more innovation, and future development. It almost makes me think it's like this daunting goal of net zero is. We have a framework for where we're going. We're almost building the plane as we're flying in a sense. And I think for people to understand that is okay to say, we have a lot you can do to get started. And we're now making very clear where the call to action is around new territories, whether it's next generation materials or innovations in coal elimination. This is the area. And also, I think that call to capital around these core areas like scaling renewables. And we have an upcoming report, which we'll discuss soon. which really looks at the blended capital approach towards decarbonization of the fashion industry. And I think this report and framework has helped us be able to even look at what the call is to innovation and investors around that.
Right.
Yeah. So in terms of filling in those gaps, I think you've spoken to it already in terms of how we fill in the gap from what we have today to where we're going. Is there anything else either of you want to say about that?
Sure. I mean, I'll start by saying the way we modeled the interventions and the reductions, we made some assumptions about how much could we turn up the dial on things like recycled polyester, organic cotton. So we set those thresholds to what we believed was a realistic level, but it shows us that we actually have to go much further in things like preferred materials. To Emily's point earlier, we have to ramp up investment in next generation materials. So there are entities out there working on making fiber out of carbon dioxide, right? And so how do we find these next generation materials that are carbon free, potentially carbon neutral, or carbon embodied, if you will. We modeled the interventions with only a half of coal being displaced. So we've got to figure out how to go from 50% coal free, which is a big deal, to 100%. And so I think we have to do all of that. And then I believe we have to figure out how can the sector continue to grow and support, workers and others, but also address the elephant in the room, which is the consumption conversation. And I think this is where circular business models and processes come into play. There's a lot of innovation happening in the sector. A lot of companies are testing new models, but how do we significantly scale those up? And, in my opinion, we really need supportive, regulatory regimes in places, because it would really be helpful for brands to actually have policies that support keeping things in life for longer, supporting recycling, supporting different business models.
Yeah, you referenced circular economy in the report. We reference it, but why was it not possible to build out, how much carbon we could save through circular economy models?
Yeah, and this gets a little wonky, but essentially there's this very technical term called a displacement rate. And so if I, as an individual, buy a used T-shirt, does that mean I don't go out and buy a brand new T-shirt? And so various researchers out there have tried to estimate what that displacement rate is, because really what you need to see happen is if I'm buying resale from platforms like ThreadUp or Poshmark or others, I'm not going out and buying new stuff, right? Because we have to reduce the amount of new stuff produced, because that's where the emissions lie. We don't really have a great way to measure that with any degree of rigor. We have consumer surveys where you ask a consumer, hey, if you buy from a platform that's resale, do you not buy something else? And so you just have to rely on that, and that's not good enough to peg an emissions reductions figure to.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing on that. Emily, anything you want to add about circular economy?
Yeah, well, one thing I'll add about filling the gap and kind of the roadmap in general is that one thing that really became crystal clear for me is that there isn't a magic bullet. There isn't one lever you can pull and therefore that's what you can focus on. It's not like I'm at an organization and I'm going to focus on renewable, or I'm at an organization and I'm going to focus on materials. You really do need to focus on all 6 of the levers. And so I think that is also where collective action becomes so important, because it is a little daunting and there is a lot of work to do. And we know what some of the solutions are, and we don't know what some of the solutions are, like some of the materials and coal. And so working together, I think, is really important so that we're all on this journey together and helping each other out, because we can't just pick one thing and do it. We really need to do it all.
Yeah, I love that. And obviously, that tees us up for the role of AII, the organization that we work for. And Emily, you and I and the rest of our leadership team has been building out our strategies around how to incorporate not only this report, but the next one around capital into our organization and how we best serve the industry and collective action. Can you say anything about how you see this report informing our core strategy?
Absolutely informs our core strategy. It's really been, and we've been using this report and some of the insights, for the last many months as we've been informing our strategy, and it's really been our framework. And so as we're looking at where should we be focusing our energy and helping our brands think about where they should be going next, we're using these 6 interventions to really identify partners like Textile Exchange and their work in materials that identifies a Textile Exchange as an important partner for AII so that we can build that piece out. So as we're developing programs and building relationships and partnerships, these 6 interventions are really the framework that we're using.
Yeah, yeah. And so I love the sort of call to action around collective action, because as you said, you kind of need to be doing all of it, but doing all of it alone with a limited sustainability budget, a limited staff of people dedicated, is almost impossible, right? So what you're alluding to is really the way to do this is industry collaboration around these pilot projects, scaling programs together in regions where we're co-investing and sort of maximizing our resources, right?
Absolutely. You're not only maximizing resources, you're maximizing knowledge and expertise too, because what is working for one organization needs to be shared with others. And then also from a financing perspective, how do we do this in the most resource efficient way as well?
Exactly. And with speed and with the time that we have. Michael, what other call to actions to the industry do you see coming out of this report?
Yeah, so I think there's a big call to action around just working together to improve sector data. And so we have a section in the roadmap that just describes why we use Textile Exchange and HIG data and how that has to be improved over time. And so that is really important. And we think that the FEM and the HIG in total is the best platform to do that. I think, just investing in and incentivizing things like renewable energy are really important. And so, if you work in the apparel sector, this dynamic in the sector where, brands are kind of telling suppliers what to do. And frankly, a lot of them as science-based targets have been coming from brands. And so the targets are set and then the kind of responsibility is thrown into the supply chain to figure out. I think what we need is to see more brands saying, I've set this target and I'm actually going to incentivize and support manufacturers to make this transition to renewable energy. I'm going to support the transition to better materials, et cetera, because otherwise, if I'm a manufacturer, it's a tough sell to invest in, let's say rooftop solar, if you have a brand customer that's not willing to support you as a customer, not maybe willing to commit or pay a little bit more for products to pay off that investment. So I think there needs to be brands and manufacturers coming together, and frankly, we're seeing that, right, with the SAC and the Fashion Charter. Lots of platforms are bringing together, but I think ultimately it's going to require investment to transition, to make this transition. And obviously, Lewis, your team is putting out this report. But the investment is needed, and I think all actors are going to have to contribute to that investment. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've been working closely with Fashion for Good and sponsored by HSBC to put together this report, which is going to come out in the next week or two, and I think we're going to reveal it on the 17th of November at Textile Exchange meetings in Dublin. So more on that.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a great preliminary discussion for anyone who has time to watch this video and hear a little bit about, the why and what behind the report. Anything else to add before we part for the day?
I just say that the industry has some really ambitious science-based targets out there, and we're slowly and quickly running out of time in order to meet these targets. And so this report is really there to help identify the actions for the apparel sector and the steps that we need to take and the steps we need to take together. So hopefully as people read the report, it will help clarify for them and help, maybe have a couple aha moments of things that they can do with their organization and how they can help decarbonize and really truly get to net zero.
That's right. And I know that as those of us on the nonprofit, programmatic, foundation, NGO side are using this report also to rally around for our partnerships, because what we want to do is start showing how all of us are working to bring solutions together as a collective and not sending the market in different directions. So this has been a really great opportunity, I think, to use a framework that also benefits those of us who are providing the solutions. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Louis. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Louis.